KM, Mr. John MD, Mr. Chumar CI, Mrs. Kunyama Koshi, Mr. Joy Kunti MC, Mr. George Kailath, Mrs. Ranjini Kailath, and Mr. Verghese VC were not able to come today. We move to the Neelasandra ward. Mrs. Thomas V. Mrs. Mani PI is absent today. We move to the Madiwala ward. Mr. Tangachin K. Mr. George Kuti KC. Mr. Tangachin B. Mrs. Eliama Tangachin. Mr. Koshi AM. And Mrs. Mary Joseph. Mr. Zachariah PC. And Mrs. Tangama Abraham were not able to be with us today. I repeat the names once again. Mr. Tangachin K. Mr. George Kuti KC. Mr. Tangachin P. Mrs. Eliama Tangachin. Mr. Koshi AM. And Mrs. Mary Joseph. We move to the Vasant Nagar ward. We have Mr. Jacob I. K. Mr. Epan Panikar AE. Mrs. Mariama Epan. Mr. Alex Patros Batai. Mrs. Susie George. Mrs. Nalini Alexander. And Mrs. Jacob Amy. Mrs. Jacob Amy. We move to the Vivek Nagar ward, which is the last ward. We have Mr. Verghese PM, Mr. Tangachin CM, Mr. Verghese PC, Mr. Verghese TM, Mr. Thomas PG, Mrs. Chinnamma Thomas, and Mrs. Mariama Thomas. Mr. Joseph PG, Mr. George Kuti PC, Mrs. Sosama John, Mrs. Matthews TM, and Mrs. Sosama Chako were absent. The foundation and backbone of our church, through whom we can all relive our memories for the last 75 years, is so glad to honor them. Thank you, His Holiness. Those instrumental in the functioning and success of our church administrative activities, we would like to recognize the unconditional service of all our former office bearers who served as secretaries, trustees, and a few who held both posts of secretary and trustee through the year.